Today I'm going to show you how to make one of these cute little bags. You can make this bag out of a denim skirt. I haven't used any interfacing on this bag because the denim was quite thick and sturdy, but if you're using a lighter denim then you may want to use interfacing, but this is fine without any interfacing. So let's get started. The first job you need to do is to remove one of the pockets. Use your unpicker. Now I'm going to remove any of the loose stitches around the edge of the pocket. I need to remove the top part of the pocket. So to do this, I draw a line across the top of the pocket and now I'm going to cut it. Out of the remaining fabric, you need to cut two pieces 11 inches by 8 inches. These are the front and back panels of the bag, and you need one piece 6 inches by 9 inches. This will be the flap over the top of the bag. Remember to take into consideration the grain of the fabric when you're cutting out your pieces so that the grain goes in the same direction on all pieces of fabric. I am using the waistband for the strap of my bag, so my next job is going to be to remove the waistband. Once the waistband has come away from the skirt, remove all the loose stitches. Next, cut two pieces of cotton lining fabric to exactly the same size as your front and back panel of your bag, which is 11 inches by 8 inches. Here are all the fabrics you will need. All the denim can be taken from an adult lady's skirt, and the lining fabric from 1/4. And this is all the hardware that you will need. Cut a piece of your lining fabric the same size as your pocket but 1.5 inches longer. Pin or clip your lining to your pocket but just across the top edge. Then take over to your sewing machine and sew across the top edge, taking 1/4 inch seam allowance, back tacking at the start and the finish. Give the pocket a quick press and pin your pocket lining to your pocket starting at the bottom, or you can use clips as I am. So clip or pin all the way round, making sure your bottom's lined up, and you should have extra fabric at the top, extra lining fabric at the top, and that's fine, that's how it should be. Mark a 2-inch opening on one side of the pocket. Now take over to the sewing machine and starting on one side, sew all the way around apart from the top edge. Don't sew across the top edge, so we're going to sew two sides and the bottom, and remember we're leaving that opening on one of the sides, so when you get to the first mark, stop and then carry on at the second mark all the way to the end. As you can see here, I'm following the original pocket line. In fact, I'm sewing on the fold line. You can just about see it. In fact, when I turn this corner and come around this corner, I think you can see a little bit more clearly. There you go. Can you see the lines? Well, I'm sewing on the outer line all the way around the pocket. Sew slowly and carefully. There's no rush. We want to get this as neat as possible. The next job is to clip the corners and to trim our seams. I trim my seam to about 1/8 inch away from my seam line. Right, the next job is to turn our pocket the right side out. So we find the hole that we left and we're going to push all the fabric back out through this hole until both the lining and the pocket are both the right side out. Use a pointed object to push out the corners. If you have a special tool like me, then that's good, but if not, you can just use a knitting needle. Don't use anything too sharp or you'll end up poking a hole in your pocket. Once you've done that, give it a quick iron and that's your pocket finished. Now we're going to attach our pocket to our front bag panel. First thing we need to do is find the centre, so I fold the panel in half to find the centre line. I also fold the pocket in half to find the centre of the pocket, and I put a mark with chalk on the centre of the pocket and the centre of the bag panel, and then I line the pocket up to where I'd like it. I'm going about 1 inch from the top of the bag and possibly 1.5 inches from the bottom. Make sure that you don't put your pocket too close to the top of the bag because you've got to allow room for a seam allowance at the top. And the same at the bottom actually, because we're going to box the corners out. So you're going to take, I think it's 1.5 inches out of each corner. So it's got to be 1.5 to 2 inches from the bottom of the bag as well. When you're happy with the placement of your pocket, then you can pin it in place. Now take over to your sewing machine and we're going to follow the original seam lines on our pocket all the way round, and as my pocket has 2 seam lines, I'm going to go all the way around the pocket, turn around and come back round on the inside seam. So I'm starting with the outer seam. I'm going to sew all the way to the top. When I get to the top, I'm going to sew a little way across the top of the pocket, only about, I don't know, 1 centimetre, and then come back down following. Can you see? I'm going to stop here, needle down, turn around, come back down, following the inner line of sewing, and continue all the way around the pocket. Of course, remembering to back tack at the start and the finish. Next, mark out 1.5 inch squares on the bottom corners of your front and back bag panels. I'm using a fabric pen to mark mine, and then when I've made the marks, I'm going to cut the corners out. With right sides facing, pin the front and the back panel together. At the sewing machine, take a 1/2 inch seam allowance and sew down the sides and the bottom, but don't sew in the square cutouts, just the sides and the bottom. Then press all of the seams open, ready for boxing out the corners. To box out the corners, we're going to put our hand inside the bag and find the hole in one of the corners. Then we're going to make sure that the bottom seam and the side seam are lined up, and then we're going to clip in place. Then do exactly the same at the other side, making sure both the bottom seam and the side seam are lined up nice and neatly, and then clip in place. Next, sew across the corners, taking a 1/2 inch seam allowance, back tacking at the start and the finish. Do exactly the same to both sides. Now turn the right side out and give the bag a quick press. You'll see it's beginning to take the shape of a bag now. Next, take your front and back lining pieces and mark a 1.5 inch square out of each corner. This is the bottom corner, not the top corner. So just the two bottom corners need a 1.5 inch square marking out. Once we've marked the corners out, we're going to get a nice sharp pair of dressmaking scissors and cut the corners out. Next, pin or clip your bag front and back panel pieces together. We're going to clip or pin down the sides, across the bottom, but not across the top. Then with a fabric pen, mark an opening at the bottom of about 3 inches. Then take over to your sewing machine and sew, taking a 1/2 inch or 1 centimetre seam allowance. Back tacking at the start and the finish. We're going to sew down both the sides and across the bottom. Don't sew around the corner cutouts that we made, just sew along the straight sides and the bottom. Remembering to leave the 3 inch opening at the bottom, ready for turning the bag the right side out later. Now press all the seams open, and then we're going to box out the corners. So again, we need to put our hand inside and make sure that we line up our side seam and our bottom seam and push the corners out and then clip in place. And then do exactly the same with the other side, making sure that the bottom seam and the side seam are matched up nicely, and then clip or pin in place. Sew across the corners, taking a 1/2 inch or 1 centimetre seam allowance, back tack at the start and the finish. Next we make the bag flap. First I mark the centre, and then I measure 1.5 inches down at each side and put a point at each side. I then draw a line from the side points to the centre, and then I cut along the lines I've just made. I then cut exactly the same shape out of the lining fabric, and then I pin the two pieces of fabric together with right sides facing. Mark an opening of about 3 inches at the top of the bag flap, and then we're going to sew all the way round, taking a 1/2 inch or 1 centimetre seam allowance, back tacking at the start and the finish. First, clip your corners and trim your seams if you want to, and then turn your bag flap the right way out. Use a sharp tool like a knitting needle to push the corners out. Then give a good press with your iron, making sure that you turn your opening under well. Now top stitch around the bag flap about 1/8 of an inch from the edge, back tacking at the start and the finish. Next, attach the bag flap to the bag. So to do this, we're going to find the centre of the bag by measuring the width of the bag from seam to seam and finding the centre point. Then in exactly the same way, we find the centre point of the bag flap. Now join the two centre points together of the bag and the bag flap, with the right side of the bag flap facing the right side of the back panel of the bag. Then I like to just check I have it the right way round. Then take over to your sewing machine and sew, taking a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. We take a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance because later we'll be sewing over it, taking 1/2 an inch seam allowance. Start by back tacking and then sew all the way along to the end of the flap and back tack at the end. Cut 2 pieces of denim fabric 2.5 inches wide and 6 inches long, and cut two pieces of the lining fabric to exactly the same size, 6 inches long and 2.5 inches wide. Now pin the lining fabric pieces to the denim fabric with right sides facing. At the sewing machine, sew these strips together, taking 1/4 inch seam allowance at each side, back tacking at the start and the finish. Doing exactly the same to both of the strips. Turn both of these strips the right side out. I use my fabric pen to do this. I turn them so far and then I push the pen inside and pull the sides down. Then I give the strips a quick press with my iron. Next, do a row of top stitching down each side of the strip, about 1/8 inch from the edge, back tacking at the start and the finish. These form the tabs to attach the strap to, and we're going to attach each one of these to the side of the bag. Thread a D-ring through the tab and line the centre of the tab up with the centre of the side seam, and clip in place. Do the same on both sides. Sew both of the tabs in place, taking a 3/8 inch seam allowance, back tacking at the start and the finish, or you can just sew backwards and forwards several times to hold them in place. Next, place our bag inside our lining with right sides facing. So our bag is the right way round and our lining the wrong way round. Join at the seams first, so match the two side seams first and get those nicely lined up. And then continue to clip or pin all the way round. Take over to the sewing machine and sew all the way around the top of the bag, taking a 1/2 inch or 1 centimetre seam allowance, back tacking at the start and the finish. Next, turn the bag the right side out through the hole that we left in the lining. Then give the bag a good ironing, especially around the top edge. Then you can either clip or pin the top edge down, ready for top stitching. Now top stitch all the way around the edge of the bag, taking about 1/8 inch seam allowance, back tacking at the start and the finish, removing the pins as we go along. I used the waistband to make the strap, so I unpicked the waistband and then also split it into two sides. I joined the two sides to make a long enough piece for the strap. I then pressed the waistband open and then folded it in half and clipped it all together. You could always just cut a piece of fabric 44 inches long and 2.5 inches wide to make your strap. Take the strap over to your sewing machine and sew, taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance, back tacking at the start and the finish, removing the clips as you go along. Next, trim the seam to about 1/8 inch away from the stitching. In order to turn this long strip the right way out, I thread a piece of cord all the way up till it came out at the other side, and then I sewed across one of the ends with my sewing machine to hold the cord in place. Sew across the top of the waistband, catching the cord in. I then pulled from the open end of the strap. I pulled the cord and I kept pulling until the strap had turned itself the right way out. I then ironed the strap to press the seams open. Now top stitch down both sides of your bag strap, back tacking at the start and the finish. I like to sew about 1/8 inch from the side. To do this, I keep the edge of my foot right next to the edge of my fabric and try to keep both lined up all the way to the end of my seam. Now we need to attach the strap to the bag. So first we're going to attach the slider. So thread your strap through the slider and then we're going to sew it in place. So I put a couple of clips, one each side, keeping my slider in place, and then I'm going to sew across to hold the slider in place. Now sew across to keep your slider in place. You've got lots of thicknesses of fabric here, so it is a little bit tricky, but it will go through, so take your time and gently feed your fabric through the machine. Now thread one of the lobster clips on the D-ring through the other end of the strap, and then we're going to thread the strap through the slider, going up one side and down the other. Then we can pull the slider along and we should end up with a lobster clip at one end, a slider, and then all that remains to be done is to put the other lobster clip at the other end of the strap. So now thread your other lobster clip onto the other side of the strap and then fold it over and clip in place. So there are not too many layers of fabric when I turn the fabric over to attach the lobster clip. I'm zigzagging at the end of the strap to finish the seam, so I only need to fold it over once, otherwise I'd have to fold it over twice and there will be too many thicknesses of fabric. Now we can sew our D-ring and lobster clip in place. So just turn over once and then we can clip in place. And now sew our D-ring and lobster clip in place, sewing backwards and forwards a couple of times. Now just clip our lobster clips to the D-rings on our handbag and that's the strap all finished. And the last job is to attach a popper to the bag flap and the pocket. So I suggest that you just follow the manufacturer's instructions on whichever popper you use because they can all be different. I would suggest using a metal popper and not the magnetic type because they often need to be put on at the beginning of the process. So you fix them between your pocket and the lining, or between the bag flap and the bag flap lining. So you'd need to do that at an earlier stage. So use a popper that you can add after you've finished the bag. And the final job is to close the opening on the lining. I slip stitch this, but you can sew it on your sewing machine if you wish. I have a video on slip stitch which I'll share the link in the description below. Thank you very much for watching today's video. I do hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, could you please like and subscribe? Thank you.